Donald Trump recently sat down with Lex Fridmen and gave a pretty bog-standard interview that we might expect from Trump. This wasn't a hard-hitting interview where Lex was asking tough questions and pushing back on all of the crazy claims Donald Trump was making. No, it was a pretty softball interview, which is kind of what we expect from Donald Trump these days, especially after we saw what happened at the NABJ, where he was put into a more adversarial environment and he crumbled and made an absolute fool out of himself. So today I want to look at this interview with Lex Fridmen, and I mostly want to look at the conversation around the 2020 election claims, and to my surprise, Donald Trump actually admits that he lost the 2020 election by a whisker. Let's go ahead and take a look.
The second time, I got millions more votes than I got the first time. So I was told if I got 63 million, which is what I got the first time, you would win. You can't not win. And I got millions of more votes than that, and lost by a whisker. And look what happened to the world with all of the wars and all of the problems. And
so I think this is a relatively new development with Trump. I think this is the second time now that he's actually admitted that he lost the 2020 election by a whisker. I think he said this exact same thing when he was speaking with Mark Levin, within the past week or so. And I find it pretty interesting that he's making these admissions because we cannot forget that Donald Trump is being prosecuted for trying to overturn the free and fair election in 2020. So I'm very curious to see if these type of statements are going to be used against him in a court of law. And I think even Lex was a bit surprised that he made this admission because he went on to ask Donald Trump about it. Let's go ahead and look at that.
Tough topic, but important. You said lost by a whisker. I'm an independent. I have a lot of friends who are independent, many of whom like your policies, like the fact that you're a deal maker, like the fact that you can end wars, but they are troubled by what happened in the 2020 election and statements about widespread fraud and this kind of stuff, fake elector scheme. What can you say to those independent voters to help them decide who to vote for?
I think the fraud was on the other side. I think the election was a fraud, and many people felt it was that, and they wanted answers. And when you can't challenge an election, you have to be able to challenge it. Otherwise, it's going to get worse, not better.
The problem was not that you challenged the election, Donald. The problem is you tried to do it in extra legal ways after you took 60 cases to court and lost on every single one of them. And then you tried to craft this fake elector scheme. You tried to submit fake electors to get him in front of Mike Pence so he would certify fake electors. That is the problem. And there are still millions of Americans that are very concerned that this is what you tried to do in 2020. So Lex is rightfully asking, hey, what can you tell these people who might have this concern? And Donald Trump just cannot muster up a meaningful answer. Of course the election was stolen. The whole thing was a fraud, is what he said. So Lex tries to ask him about it again. Let's see if he can muster up a decent response.
So a lot of people believe that there was some shady stuff that went on with the election, whether it's media bias or big tech, but still the claim of widespread fraud is the thing that bothers people.
Well, I don't focus on the past. I focus on the future. I mean, I talk about how bad the economy is, how bad inflation is, how bad things like, which is important. Afghanistan was, in my opinion, the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to our country.
I think it's pretty funny that Donald Trump says that he lives in the future, not the past, when all we hear about is how the 2020 election was stolen from him, that there was widespread voter fraud, or that there's a deep state working against him. I mean, come on. This is pathetic stuff from Donald Trump. People are rightly concerned that you might challenge in extra legal ways the 2024 election. All Lex is asking for here is like some assurance that the next election is going to go smoothly and you're not going to try to overturn it like you did the last one. And instead, you try to bring up Afghanistan and how it was the worst thing to ever happen to our country. I mean, in no world does this response make sense. And Lex even tries to ask him about it one more time. To his credit, at least Lex did ask, I think, 3 different times about the election. Let's go ahead and see this last response.
Well, let me just linger on the election a little bit more. For this election, it might be a close one. What can we do to avoid the insanity and division of the previous election, whether you win or lose?
Well, I hope it's not a close one. I mean, I don't know how people can vote for somebody that has destroyed our country. The inflation, the bad economy, but to me, in a way, the worst is what they've allowed to happen at our border, where they've allowed millions of people to come in here from places that you don't want to know about. And I can't believe that that's going to be a close election. We're leading in the polls, and it looks close, but I think in the end, it's not going to be a close election.
What do you think is the right way to solve the immigration crisis? Is mass deportation one of the solutions you would think about?
Well, you've got to get the criminals out of here fast, right? The people from mental institutions, you got to get them back into their mental institution. No country can afford this. It's just too much money.
So again, Donald Trump is asked, is there anything that you can say that might put to rest some people's fears about the way you treated the last election? How can you assure us that the next election will go smoothly, or that we can avoid some of the division that came out of the last election? But Donald Trump is just incapable of answering. Instead, he talks about how Joe Biden destroyed our country. And then he pivots to the southern border, or then how he's leading in the polls, and then how it's not going to be a close election. And then Lex Fridmen just eventually gives up and says, okay, well, how do we deal with immigration? Are you going to do mass deportations? So even Lex got tired of listening to Trump's rambles. I don't know how people think that this guy is presidential. So Lex goes on to ask Trump, how can we go about alleviating some of the division in our country? This is a legitimate question. I think anybody running for president should be asked this question. There is quite a divide among the two sides right now. This is a good question to ask. Let's go ahead and see what Donald Trump had to say.
The country seems more divided than ever.
Yeah.
What can you do to help alleviate some of that division?
Well, you can get rid of these 2 people. They're terrible. They're terrible. You don't want to have them running this country. They're not equipped to run it. Joe, it's a disaster, okay? And Kamala, I think she'll end up being worse than him.
So even Lex Fridmen looks a bit shocked by Trump's answer here. Mr. Trump, how can you alleviate some of the division in this country? Oh, well, you got to throw Joe Biden and Kamala Harris out of here. Kamala Harris is going to be worse than Joe Biden. I mean, in no world does this answer make any sense, because it is just more divisive rhetoric from Trump. He always forgets that at least half of the country support Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And so for him to immediately go on the attack against them doesn't seem like a smart thing to do for somebody who's running for president. Are you just going to discard half of the country if you win in November? I mean, what are people supposed to take from that answer? I think even Lex Fridmen was surprised. So he tries to give him another opportunity to at least say something more meaningful on this topic. Let's go ahead and look at that.
From my personal opinion, I think you are at your best when you're talking about a positive vision of the future versus criticizing the other side.
Yeah, I think you have to criticize, though. I think they're nasty. They came up with a story that I looked down and I called soldiers that died in World War I suckers and losers.
So again, Trump is just incapable of producing a meaningful answer to what should be a pretty simple question. He even strokes his ego along the way. Lex says, I think you're your best when you're talking about the future of the country. And Trump is still not able to provide an answer that might be comforting or look presidential to the American people. Instead, he goes on to some conspiracy about how the left made up a story about him calling soldiers suckers and losers. A story, by the way, that has been verified by multiple people, many of whom I would trust way more than I trust Donald Trump. Them's just the facts. So Lex Fridmen gives him one more shot to have a win. And he asks one of the, most basic questions, a question that we hear at most debates, and that is, what is something that you respect about people on the left? Let's see how Trump did.
But on the previous thing, in the spirit of unity, you used to be a Democrat.
Yeah.
Setting the politicians aside, what do you respect most about people who lean left, who are Democrats themselves or of that persuasion, progressives, liberals, and so on?
Well, look, I respect the fact that everybody's in there. And, to a certain extent, life is what you do while you're waiting to die. So you might as well do a good job. I think in terms of what's happening now, I think, we have a chance to save the country. This country's going down. And I called it with Venezuela. I called it with a lot of different countries. And this country is going down. If we don't win this election, the election coming up on November 5th is the most important election this country's ever had. Because if we don't win it, I don't know that there'll be another election. And it's going to be a communist country.
This should have been one of the most easy questions for Trump to answer. We hear it on the political landscape quite a bit. What is it about the other side that you like or that you respect? But Trump, being the malignant narcissist he is, cannot even come up with anything close to a meaningful answer. Instead, he goes on the attack again. He's trying to say that we're terrible people, that if, we don't win, we're not going to have a country anymore. This country's going down. Why do people think that this dude would make a good president? This was not a presidential interview, even though he was given softball questions. Now, to Lex's credit, like I said, he did push back kind of on some of the claims surrounding the 2020 election, but I definitely wish he was more forceful towards Trump. I think if you're somebody like Lex Fridmen, who has over 4 million subscribers, such a huge platform, I think you have some obligation to push back on these wild conspiracies espoused by Trump. I feel like if I had a large platform like that, I would feel a responsibility to push back. So I'm a little bit disappointed that Lex Fridmen did not push back in a very meaningful way and that it was a mostly softball interview. Normally I tell people to go watch these interviews, but there wasn't anything in this particular interview that was super eye-grabbing or super nutty or whatever it may be. It was pretty boring. Trump slurred his way through most of it. Some parts he was actually incoherent because he seems so drowsy or whatever's going on here. But that is that. Trump bombs his way through another softball interview. Doesn't sound presidential at all. Didn't really produce any meaningful answers that the American people could look at and say, hey, yeah, maybe that guy could be president. I didn't get that takeaway at all from this interview. I think it's just more of the same from Trump. He's a malignant narcissist who only looks out for himself, and he continues to undermine our institutions by claiming the 2020 election was rigged, stolen. But I do think it was funny that he admitted that he lost the 2020 election. by a Whisker. I thought that was pretty hilarious. So that's going to do it for me on this one, folks. If you got anything out of this video, if you could remember to smash that like button and hit subscribe, maybe share it with a friend or two, I'd very much appreciate that. If you think I got something wrong, or if you disagree with me on something, feel free to drop a comment below. And if you want to learn about Trump's connections to Project 2025, go ahead and watch that video on the screen now. And I will see you guys on the next one.